Hello and good day. This is the Bible Bard. A bard is a storyteller who recites in the past traditional texts associated with a particular oral tradition. I'm here to recite and to amplify what the literature of the Bible says about who is God and who are human beings. Here's the place we're at today. Critics of the Bible contend that certain biblical passages seem to them to condone, regulate, or fail to explicitly condemn the practice of human slavery. The idea critics promote is that if the God of the Bible is so good, why didn't he 5,000 years ago condemn the human practice of slavery? Or at least, once Jesus arrives, why didn't he condemn it 2,000 years ago? The Bible Bard is interested in what the Bible actually says about issues, but before I list several Bible verses that detail the biblical content and the individual author's attitudes towards slavery, let's first look at slavery itself as an institution, the kinds of slavery there used to be. First of all, there used to be something voluntary slavery. In ancient times, individuals who found themselves on the edge of poverty could sell themselves into slavery, thereby escaping poverty, or starvation. In the Mosaic Law, if a Hebrew did this, the law of God required such slaves to be released after serving for 6 years. See Deuteronomy 15, verses 12 to 18. After America was founded, the poor who wanted to escape Europe could enter into indentured servitude by signing a slavery contract binding them to so many years of labor in exchange for passage to the New World. Then in societies with no bankruptcy system, creditors would seize debtors and or family members as slaves when the debtor defaulted on their debt. You can see the Code of Hammurabi from Babylonia. This practice continues today in various countries. And then there's involuntary slavery. This was common in most ancient and pre-modern societies where, for example, defeated armies and civilian populations were captured and enslaved as spoils of war. You can see the history of Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, China, and Rome for examples of that. There's also in this category chattel slavery, which is absolute slavery where people are treated as property and enslaved for life. In some cases, people could buy their way to freedom, as in the case of Odola Equiano, who wrote a book about it. After raiding an area in the British Isles, the Vikings often enslaved people, some learned, and sold them into Europe as teachers, personal assistants, and household servants. In Aztec and Incan societies, tributary slaves were required of subject nations. There's also penal slavery, where instead of being executed or corporally punished, convicted criminals could be enslaved. There are also slave soldiers, mostly in the Islamic world, and in Africa. For example, the Mamluks in Egypt and the Ottoman Janissaries made soldiers out of slaves. And then, of course, there's always sexual slavery, which is concubinage, which is practiced in many ancient societies. In Islam, the Quran in 4:24 says female war captives are allowed to be used as sexual concubines. In the ancient world, 10,000 BC to 1000 AD, slavery was technology. If you needed air conditioning, a slave waved a palm frond over your head. If you needed your house heated, a slave would gather wood and make a fire. If you needed water, a slave would carry it from a well or the river to your house. Pyramids were built, often using slave labor. Canals were dug. Slaves in mines searched for gold. These are just a few obvious examples. Now, the Bible describes the basis for slavery coming from human nature. Galatians 5:19 states, quote, "The acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. Slavery is a mode of human dominance of other humans. It is not a spiritual mode of the God of the Bible. During this age, human beings can oppose God, curse God, reject and defy the God of the Bible, and during their lives, they often appear to not be judged or punished by God. They can live as the verse Galatians 5:19 I just read describes. During the age to come, this freedom that human beings use now to gratify their evil desires, to be as different from God as they wish, that freedom will end. Here's what the Bible actually says now about our topic about human slavery. The Bible Bard is interested, of course, in what the Bible actually says, not what critics say it says, most of whom these critics have not even read what the Bible teaches. Hebrew Scriptures says that 3,000 to 4,000 years ago was the timeline in Exodus 21, verse 16, quote, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession, end quote. Comment, the gateway to slavery is kidnapping. It's condemned in the Bible 3,500 plus years ago in the Mosaic Law. Of course, this is God's law to the Hebrew nation, and the surrounding countries and peoples in the world empires did not recognize that law or abide by it. Leviticus 25, verses 39 through 43, the biblical text says, quote, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly. Comment, this law, again, only applies to Hebrews, among Hebrews. The next verse, 44 to 46, accept the institution of slavery as practiced in other nations. Non-Jews could be purchased as chattel slaves by Jews. Even here, this recognition is not advocacy. Instead, it is recognition that slavery is or was an aspect of human society. You can see the next section for additional comment on these three verses. In Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16, the text says, quote, if a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Do not oppress them, end quote. Comment, protection for runaway slaves is required under the law of Moses. And this verse was used often in America in the groups of people who were against slavery and tried to help slaves escape. In Isaiah 58:6, the text says, quote, is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke, end quote. Comment, in ancient societies, enslaved laborers and oxen were controlled using a yoke. Breaking every yoke in this text is a call to believers in God to oppose enslavement, which occurred in the 18th and 19th centuries in the West. Slavery in the East continued until the 20th century. The moral force behind the anti-slavery movement was, of course, Christian and based upon these biblical texts I've just read you. This force succeeded in part in that chattel slavery is outlawed today in most nations. The source of this social movement arising mostly from a Christian interpretation of the biblical text. However, because of the hardness of the human heart, bonded labor, debt slavery, and human trafficking continue to this day. More on Leviticus 25, verse 44 to 46. Here's an extended quote from the text about slavery in the Bible. Quote, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residences living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Comment, there's no doubt that these 3 verses allowed chattel slavery in the Bible. But because the Bible Bard deals with the Bible as literature, what can be said about this exceptional text? First of all, this allowance is part of the law of Moses, given, hear this out, exclusively to the nation of Israel alone. This law was evidence of their special chosen relationship to God among the nations. Therefore, this content does not apply to any non-Jews or to any Jews who are not living in the land of promise. Number 2, this text is not advocacy. The text is an allowance or a concession. Just for example, divorce was not allowed until Moses allowed the men who want to divorce their wives to create a certificate of divorce and give it to their current wife and send her away. And Jesus said that that was a concession made because of the hardness of their heart. And Mark 10, 1-9, the enemies of Jesus came to him with this question about divorce, and they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? This question was a trap to get Jesus to contradict the law. The Pharisees already knew Jesus was against divorce, but Jesus gave an answer that not only held to his strict position against divorce, but also upheld the law. He said in Mark 10, verse 5, quote, it was because of your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. In other words, according to Jesus, an allowance was made in the law for marital incompatibility that allowed a certificate of divorce to be written and the divorced wife to be sent away. This was a concession made because of human nature and culture, and not because this was a marital solution that God approved of and advocated. And this is a parallel to slavery. It's the same thing. It's not advocated, but is a concession made because in the ancient world, slavery was technology. You use a cell phone today to communicate. In the past, you gave your slave a note or told him what to say and sent him somewhere to say it. It's the same thing as far as technology is concerned. The Bible Bard makes the same argument here for the text on slavery. The ancient Israelites could engage in chattel slavery under this legal exception. Only non-Israelites could be enslaved in these terms. Does this make the God of the Bible culpable for the advocacy of slavery? I don't think so. Because the use of the institution of slavery throughout human society, and because slavery was the technology of ancient times, this text allows slavery to be practiced in ancient Hebrew societies under conditions and with restrictions that make it apparent this is an exception only allowed because of the hardness of the human heart and not because a moral God was promoting this human failing. The conclusion is God hated divorce and God hates slavery, but addressed human nature with his ancient people through these exceptions. The Greek scriptures in the New Testament, 2,000 plus years ago, has these comments about it. Matthew 7, verse 12, quote, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up all the law and the prophets. Comment, early in his ministry, Jesus gives his initial rule for social living, a rule that is incompatible with slavery. If we do this, he says, it sums up the law that permitted slavery. Do to others as you would have them do to you. It sums it up and is a rule for actual human social living. In Matthew 22:39, it says, quote, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, slavery certainly cannot be a part of that verse. Comment, late in his ministry, Jesus again provides spiritual direction for living that is incompatible with slavery. You can also see this in Mark 12:31. In Galatians 3:28, the text reads, quote, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. In other words, within Christianity, one's social position within humanity is void. Regardless of human status, the followers of Christ are to recognize these human distinctions are to be discarded when you're before God. Christians are to consider all people as equal to themselves before God, regardless of their human social position. In Galatians 5, verse 1, it says, quote, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. End quote. Now, that slavery it's speaking of is human slavery to evil or to sin. And it's a parallel, isn't it, to physical slavery. Comment, this verse compares Christian life to the life of non-Christians, extolling the freedom before God that comes from following Christ, to the slavery or sinfulness of life when living as described above in Galatians 5:19. Once again, the yoke of slavery found in Isaiah 58:6 is enjoined. The difference between Isaiah and Galatians is 650 plus years. This is remarkable literary consistency where Old and New Testaments both use the same metaphor based on what people knew, human slavery, in terms of a spiritual sense of slavery to sin. In Colossians 4:1, the text says, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Comment, this remark harkens back to the command of Jesus to treat others as you want to be treated. But Paul, the writer, adds a motivation for Philemon, a person he's writing about, that God has control over the lives of believers, even as a slave master has control over his subjects. This is, again, a metaphor based on a reality. In 1 Timothy 1, verses 9 through 10, the text reads, quote, we know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for slave traders and liars, end quote. Comment, in Paul's biblical list of despicable human activities, he lists slave traders. In Philemon's verse 1, or chapter 1, verse 15 and 16, the text reads, quote, perhaps the reason he, Onesimus, a runaway slave of this man Philemon, perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother, end quote. This text was written some 1960 years ago during the widespread slavery period of the Roman world. Comment, this is a book of the Bible called Philemon that's focused on a slave named Onesimus who runs away from his Christian master and goes for protection to the religious teacher of that master, Paul the Apostle. The Jew Paul harbors him, which is according to the law of Moses. But when Onesimus the slave becomes a Christian, Paul advises him to return and submit to his master Philemon. And when he does so, he sends along a letter with the slave instructing Philemon to treat Onesimus, his former slave and runaway, as a Christian brother and not as a slave. Once again, while Christians are living in a world of human social status, they are instructed to ignore that status when dealing with a fellow believer. Summary. Slavery is as common to human society as water is to fish. Someone immersed in this institution needs God's revelation to reject this evil human institution. As shown above, ancient biblical writers wrote out of a milieu that included both daily observations of real slavery and biblical negative comments, prohibitions, or restrictions about the practice of slavery. Slavery abolitionists in America, 1775 to 1870, many of whom were Christians, used these biblical texts to encourage other citizens of the country to promote the abolition of slavery in the USA. The deliberate attempts by critics and anti-religionists to disregard both the clear message of the biblical text and the anti-slavery historical efforts led by Christians are truly reprehensible. Both in the law of Moses in the Old Testament and in the words of Jesus in the New Testament and in the writings of Paul, slavery is shown to be incompatible with the desire and nature of the God of the Bible. The Bible is literature that describes who God is and who human beings are and condemns slavery even 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, when the general policy throughout human society was to practice enslavement in all the ways detailed at the beginning of this podcast. Conclusion. This is the way the Bible Bard works. Brief recitations are closely focused. No distractions, no rabbit trails. We're talking about what the literature of the Bible states, the ideas and concepts it presents, because most people have never engaged with biblical thought. Make up your own mind whether you agree or disagree with the Bible's pronouncements. Go to www.BibleBard.org to download a transcript, listen to another episode from the archive, or get links to other materials and information. We'd like you to support the Bible Bard podcast on Patreon at BibleBardUS as you search it. As little as $1 a week or $5 a month helps to cover the costs of the podcast. You can also give at GoFundMe or at the website. Click the Donate tab and make a contribution. Send the Bible Bard any questions or remarks you care to offer to BibleBardUS@gmail.com. We're glad to hear from you. Connections, and thank you in advance. You know how this works. We need you to follow, subscribe, share, and comment on Bible Bard content from our many platforms. Also be aware the Bible Bard's English podcast is translated into other languages and available on most audio platforms. You can listen in Urdu, Chiguwa, Swahili, Hindi, Spanish, Nepali, and we're still trying to get a Bengali speaker to record the Bengali transcripts. So help us if you can, and keep listening. Invite others to listen with you. Until next time, this is the Bible Bard.